Quo Vadis by Henryk Sienkiewicz. Translated from the Polish by Jeremiah Querton. Chapter 1. Petronius woke only about midday, and as usual greatly wearied. The evening before he had been at one of Nero's feasts, which was prolonged till late at night. For some time his health had been failing. He said himself that he woke up benumbed, as it were, and without power of collecting his thoughts. But the morning bath and careful kneading of the body by trained slaves hastened gradually the course of his slothful blood, roused him, quickened him, restored his strength, so that he issued from the Eleothecium, that is, the last division of the bath, as if he had risen from the dead, with eyes gleaming from wit and gladness, rejuvenated, filled with life, exquisite, so unapproachable that Otho himself could not compare with him, and was really that which he had been called, arbiter elegantiarum. He visited the public baths rarely, only when some rhetor happened there who roused admiration and who was spoken of in the city, or when in the Ephebias there were combats of exceptional interest. Moreover, he had in his own insula private baths which Sylla, the famous contemporary of Severus, had extended for him, reconstructed and arranged with such uncommon taste that Nero himself acknowledged their excellence over those of the emperor, though the imperial baths were more extensive and finished with incomparably greater luxury. After that feast, at which he was bored by the jesting of Vadinius with Nero, Lucan, and Seneca, he took part in a diatribe as to whether woman has a soul. Rising late, he used, as was his custom, the baths. 2 enormous balnitors laid him on a cypress table covered with snow-white Egyptian byssus, and with hands dipped in perfumed olive oil began to rub his shapely body, and he waited with closed eyes till the heat of the laconicum and the heat of their hands passed through him and expelled weariness. But after a certain time he spoke, and opened his eyes. He inquired about the weather, and then about gems which the jeweler Idomeneus had promised to send him for examination that day. It appeared that the weather was beautiful, with a light breeze from the Alban hills, and that the gems had not been brought. Petronius closed his eyes again, and had given command to bear him to the tepidrium, when from behind the curtain the nomenclator looked in, announcing that young Marcus Vinicius, recently returned from Asia Minor, had come to visit him. Petronius ordered to admit the guest to the tepidrium, to which he was borne himself. Vinicius was the son of his oldest sister, who years before had married Marcus Vinicius, a man of consular dignity from the time of Tiberius. The young man was serving then under Corbulo against the Parthians, and at the close of the war had returned to the city. Petronius had for him a certain weakness bordering on attachment, for Marcus was beautiful and athletic, a young man who knew how to preserve a certain aesthetic measure in his profligacy. This, Petronius prized above everything. "A greeting to Petronius," said the young man, entering the tepidrium with a springy step. "May all the gods grant thee success, but especially Asclepius and Cypras, for under their double protection nothing evil can meet one. I greet thee in Rome, and may thy rest be sweet after war," replied Petronius, extending his hand from between the folds of soft carbas stuff in which he was wrapped. "What's to be heard in Armenia, or since thou wert in Asia, didst thou not stumble into Bithynia?" Petronius on time had been proconsul in Bithynia, and, what is more, he had governed with energy and justice. This was a marvelous contrast in the character of a man noted for effeminacy and love of luxury. Hence he was fond of mentioning those times, as they were a proof of what he had been, and of what he might have become yet it pleased him. "I happened to visit Heraclea," answered Vinicius. "Corbulo sent me there with an order to assemble reinforcements." "Ah, Heraclea! I knew at Heraclea a certain maiden from Colchis, for whom I would have given all the divorced women of this city, not excluding Poppaea. But these are old stories. Tell me now, rather, what is to be heard from the Parthian boundary." "It is true that they weary me every Vologeses of them, and Tiridates and Tigranes, those barbarians who, as young Arilenas insists, walk on all fours at home, and pretends to be human only when in our presence. But now people in Rome speak much of them, if only for the reason that it is dangerous to speak of aught else. The war is going badly, and but for Corbulo might be turned to defeat." Corbulo, by Bacchus, a real god of war, a genuine Mars, a great leader, at the same time quick-tempered, honest, and dull. I love him, even for this, that Nero is afraid of him. Corbulo is not a dull man. Perhaps thou art right, but for that matter 'tis all one. Dullness, as Pyrrho says, is in no way worse than wisdom, and differs from it in nothing. Vinicius began to talk of the war, but when Petronius closed his eyes again, the young man, seeing his uncle's tired and somewhat emaciated face, changed the conversation, and inquired with a certain interest about his health. Petronius opened his eyes again. Health? No. He did not feel well. He had not gone so far yet, it is true, as young Cisna, who had lost sensation to such a degree that when he was brought to the bath in the morning he inquired, "Am I sitting?" But he was not well. Vinicius had just committed him to the care of Asclepius and Cypris. But he, Petronius, did not believe in Asclepius. It was not known even whose son that Asclepius was, the son of Arsinoe or Coronis, and if the mother was doubtful, what was to be said of the father? Who, in that time, could be sure who his own father was? Hereupon Petronius began to laugh. Then he continued, 2 years ago, it is true, I sent to Epidaurus 3 dozen live blackbirds and a goblet of gold. But dost thou know why? I said to myself, whether this helps or not, it will do me no harm. Though people make offerings to the gods, yet I believe that all think as I do, all, with the exception, perhaps, of mule drivers hired at the Porta Capena by travelers. Besides Asclepius, I have had dealings with sons of Asclepius. When I was troubled a little last year in the bladder, they performed an incubation for me. I saw that they were tricksters, but I said to myself, what harm? The world stands on deceit, and life is an illusion. The soul is an illusion too. But one must have reason enough to distinguish pleasant from painful illusions. I shall give command to burn in my hypocaustum cedar wood sprinkled with ambergris, for during life I prefer perfumes to stenches. As to Cypris, to whom thou hast also confided me, I have known her guardianship to the extent that I have twinges in my right foot. But as to the rest, she is a good goddess. I suppose that thou wilt bear sooner or later white doves to her altar. True, answered Vinicius. The arrows of the Parthians have not reached my body, but a dart of a Moor has struck me unexpectedly, a few stadia from a gate of this city. By the white knees of the Graces, thou wilt tell me of this at a leisure hour. I have come purposely to get thy advice, answered Marcus. But at that moment the epilators came, and occupied themselves with Petronius. Marcus, throwing aside his tunic, entered a bath of tepid water, for Petronius invited him to a plunge bath. Ah, I have not even asked whether thy feeling is reciprocated, said Petronius, looking at the youthful body of Marcus, which was as if cut out of marble. Had Lysippos seen thee, thou wouldst be ornamenting now the gate leading to the Palatine, as a statue of Hercules in youth. The young man smiled with satisfaction, and began to sink in the bath, splashing warm water abundantly on the mosaic which represented Hera at the moment when she was imploring sleep to lull Zeus to rest. Petronius looked at him with the satisfied eye of an artist. When Vinicius had finished and yielded himself and turned to the epilators, a lector came in with a bronze tube at his breast and rolls of paper in the tube. Dost wish to listen? Asked Petronius. If it is thy creation, gladly, answered the young tribune. If not, I prefer conversation. Poets seize people at present on every street corner. Of course they do. Thou wilt not pass any basilica, bath, library, or bookshop without seeing a poet gesticulating like a monkey. Agrippa, on coming here from the east, mistook them for madmen, and it is just such a time now. Caesar writes verses, hence all follow in his steps. Only it is not permitted to write better verses than Caesar, and for that reason I fear a little for Lucan. But I write prose, with which, however, I do not honor myself or others. What the lector has to read are codicilli of that poor Fabricius Veiento. Why poor? Because it has been communicated to him that he must dwell in Odyssa and not return to his domestic hearth till he receives a new command. That Odyssey will be easier for him than for Ulysses, since his wife is no Penelope. I need not tell thee, for that matter, that he acted stupidly. But here no one takes things otherwise than superficially. His is rather a wretched and dull little book, which people have begun to read passionately only when the author is banished. Now one hears on every side, scandala, scandala, and it may be that Veiento invented some things, but I, who know the city, know our patres and our women, assure thee that it is all paler than reality. Meanwhile every man is searching in the book, for himself with alarm, for his acquaintances with delight. At the bookshop of Avernus 100 copyists are writing at dictation, and its success is assured. Are not thy affairs in it? They are, but the author is mistaken, for I am at once worse and less flat than he represents me. Sayest thou we have lost long since the feeling of what is worthy or unworthy, and to me even it seems that in real truth there is no difference between them, though Seneca, Musonius, and Trasca pretend that they see it. To me it is all one. By Hercules, I say what I think. I have preserved loftiness, however, because I know what is deformed and what is beautiful, but our poet, Bronzebeard, for example, the charioteer, the singer, the actor, does not understand this. I am sorry, however, for Fabricius. He is a good companion. Vanity ruined the man. Every one suspected him, no one knew certainly, but he could not contain himself, and told the secret on all sides in confidence. Hast heard the history of Rufinus? No. Then come to the frigidarium to cool, there I will tell thee. They passed to the frigidarium, in the middle of which played a fountain of bright rose color, emitting the odor of violets. There they sat in niches which were covered with velvet, and began to cool themselves. Silence reigned for a time. Vinicius looked a while thoughtfully at a bronze fawn which, bending over the arm of a nymph, was seeking her lips eagerly with his lips. He is right, said the young man. That is what is best in life. More or less. But besides this thou lovest war, for which I have no liking, since under tents one's fingernails break and cease to be rosy. For that matter, every man has his preferences. Bronzebeard loves song, especially his own, and old scores his Corinthian vase, which stands near his bed at night, and which he kisses when he cannot sleep. He has kissed the edge off already. Tell me, dost thou not write verses? No, I have never composed a single hexameter. And dost thou not play on the lute and sing? No. And dost thou drive a chariot? I tried once in Antioch, but unsuccessfully. Then I am at rest concerning thee. Into what party in the hippodrome dost thou belong? To the Greens. Now I am perfectly at rest, especially since thou hast a large property indeed, though thou art not so rich as Pallas or Seneca. For sayest thou, with us at present it is well to write verses, to sing to a lute, to declaim, and to compete in the circus, but better, and especially safer, not to write verses, not to play, not to sing, and not to compete in the circus. Best of all, is it to know how to admire when Bronzebeard admires. Thou art a comely young man, hence Poppaea may fall in love with thee. This is thy only peril. But no, she is too experienced, she cares for something else. She has had enough of love with her 2 husbands, with the third she has other views. Dost thou know that that stupid Otho loves her yet to distraction? He walks on the cliffs of Spain, and sighs. He has so lost his former habits, and so ceased to care for his person, that 3 hours each day suffice him to dress his hair. Who could have expected this of Otho? I understand him, answered Vinicius, but in his place I should have done something else. What, namely? I should have enrolled faithful legions of mountaineers of that country. They are good soldiers, those Iberians. Vinicius, I almost wish to tell thee that thou wouldst not have been capable of that. And knowest why? Such things are done, but they are not mentioned even conditionally. As to me, in his place, I should have laughed at Poppaea, laughed at Bronzebeard, and formed for myself legions, not of Iberian men, however, but Iberian women. And what is more, I should have written epigrams which I should not have read to anyone, not like that poor Rufinus. Thou wert to tell me his history, I will tell it in the Unctaurium. But in the Unctaurium the attention of Vinicius was turned to other objects, namely, to wonderful slave women who were waiting for the bathers. 2 of them, Africans, resembling noble statues of ebony, began to anoint their bodies with delicate perfumes from Arabia. Others, Phrygians, skilled in hairdressing, held in their hands, which were bending and flexible as serpents, combs and mirrors of polished steel. 2 Grecian maidens from Cos, who were simply like deities, waited as Vestacles, till the moment should come to put statuesque folds in the togas of the lords. By the cloud-scattering Zeus, said Marcus Vinicius, what a choice thou hast. I prefer choice to numbers, answered Petronius. My whole familia, household servants, in Rome does not exceed 400, and I judge that for personal attendance only upstarts need a greater number of people. More beautiful bodies even Bronzebeard does not possess, said Vinicius, distending his nostrils. Thou art my relative, answered Petronius, with a certain friendly indifference, and I am neither so misanthropic as Barsus nor such a pedant as Aulus Plautius. When Vinicius heard this last name, he forgot the maidens from Cos for a moment, and, raising his head vivaciously, inquired, "Whence did Aulus Plautius come to thy mind?" "Dost thou know that after I had disjointed my arm outside the city, I passed a number of days in his house?" It happened that Plautius came up at the moment when the accident happened, and, seeing that I was suffering greatly, he took me to his house. There a slave of his, the physician Marian, restored me to health. "I wished to speak with thee touching this very matter." "Why? Is it because thou hast fallen in love with Pomponia perchance?" "In that case I pity thee. She is not young, and she is virtuous." "I cannot imagine a worse combination." "Brr. Not with Pomponia Eheu," answered Vinicius. "With whom, then?" "If I knew myself with whom. But I do not know to a certainty her name even. Lygia or Colina?" "They call her Ligia in the house, for she comes of the Lygian nation, but she has her own barbarian name, Colina." "It is a wonderful house, that of those Plautiuses. There are many people in it, but it is quiet there as in the groves of Subiacum." For a number of days I did not know that a divinity dwelt in the house. Once about daybreak I saw her bathing in the garden fountain, and I swear to thee by that foam from which Aphrodite roused, that the rays of the dawn passed right through her body. I thought that when the sun rose she would vanish before me in the light, as the twilight of morning does. Since then, I have seen her twice, and since then, too, I know not what rest is, I know not what other desires are, I have no wish to know what the city can give me. I want neither women, nor gold, nor Corinthian bronze, nor amber, nor pearls, nor wine, nor feasts. I want only Lygia. I am yearning for her. In sincerity I tell thee, Petronius, as that dream who is imaged on the mosaic of thy tepidrium yearn for Paesitia, whole days and night do I yearn. If she is a slave, then purchase her. She is not a slave. What is she? A freed woman of Plautius? Never having been a slave, she could not be a freed woman. Who is she? I know not, a king's daughter, or something of that sort. Thou dost rouse my curiosity, Vinicius. But if thou wish to listen, I will satisfy thy curiosity straightway. Her story is not a long one. Thou art acquainted, perhaps personally, with Vannius, king of the Suevi, who, expelled from his country, spent a long time here in Rome, and became even famous for his skillful play with dice, and his good driving of chariots. Drusus put him on the throne again. Vannius, who was really a strong man, ruled well at first, and warred with success. Afterward, however, he began to skin not only his neighbors, but his own Suevi, too much. Thereupon Vangio and Ceto, two sister sons of his, and the sons of Vibilius, king of the Hermunduri, determined to force him to Rome again to try his luck there at dice. I remember, that is of recent Claudian times. Yes. War broke out. Vannius summoned to his aid the Iazigi, his dear nephews called in the Lygians, who, hearing of the riches of Vannius, and enticed by the hope of booty, came in such numbers that Caesar himself, Claudius, began to fear for the safety of the boundary. Claudius did not wish to interfere in a war among barbarians, but he wrote to Atilius Hister, who commanded the legions of the Danube, to turn a watchful eye on the course of the war, and not permit them to disturb our peace. Hister required, then, of the Lygians a promise not to cross the boundary. To this they not only agreed, but gave hostages, among whom were the wife and daughter of their leader. It is known to thee that barbarians take their wives and children to war with them. My Lygia is the daughter of that leader. Whence dost thou know all this? Aulus Plautius told it himself. The Lygians did not cross the boundary, indeed, but barbarians come and go like a tempest. So did the Lygians vanish with their wild ox horns on their heads. They killed Vannius's Suevi and Iazigi, but their own king fell. They disappeared with their booty then, and the hostages remained in Hister's hands. The mother died soon after, and Hister, not knowing what to do with the daughter, sent her to Pomponius, the governor of all Germany. He, at the close of the war with the Catti, returned to Rome, where Claudius, as is known to thee, permitted him to have a triumph. The maiden on that occasion walked after the car of the conqueror, but, at the end of the solemnity, since hostages cannot be considered captives, and since Pomponius did not know what to do with her definitely, he gave her to his sister Pomponia Graecina, the wife of Plautius. In that house where all beginning with the masters and ending with the poultry in the hen house are virtuous, that maiden grew up as virtuous, alas, as Grisina herself, and so beautiful that even Poppaea, if near her, would seem like an autumn fig near an apple of the Hesperides. And what? And I repeat to thee that from the moment when I saw how the sun rays at that fountain passed through her body, I fell in love to distraction. She is as transparent as a lamprey eel, then, or a youthful sardine. Jest not, Petronius, but if the freedom with which I speak of my desire misleads thee, know this, that bright garments frequently cover deep wounds. I must tell thee, too, that, while returning from Asia, I slept one night in the temple of Mopsus to have a prophetic dream. Well, Mopsus appeared in a dream to me, and declared that, through love, a great change in my life would take place. Pliny declares, as I hear, that he does not believe in the gods, but he believes in dreams, and perhaps he is right. My jests do not prevent me from thinking at times that in truth there is only one deity, eternal, creative, all-powerful, Venus Genitrix. She brings souls together, she unites bodies and things. Eros called the world out of chaos. Whether he did well is another question, but, since he did so, we should recognize his might, though we are free not to bless it. Alas, Petronius, it is easier to find philosophy in the world than wise counsel. Tell me, what is thy wish especially? I wish to have Lygia. I wish that these arms of mine, which now embrace only air, might embrace Lygia and press her to my bosom. I wish to breathe with her breath. Were she a slave, I would give Alice for her 100 maidens with feet whitened with lime as a sign that they were exhibited on sale for the first time. I wish to have her in my house till my head is as white as the top of Siract in winter. She is not a slave, but she belongs to the family of Plautius, and since she is a deserted maiden, she may be considered an alumna. Plautius might yield her to thee if he wished. Then it seems that thou knowest not Pomponia Grisina. Both have become as much attached to her as if she were their own daughter. Pomponia I know, a real Cyprus. If she were not the wife of Alice, she might be engaged as a mourner. Since the death of Julius she has not thrown aside dark robes, and in general she looks as if, while still alive, she were walking on the asphodel meadow. She is, moreover, a one-man woman. Hence, among our ladies of 4 and 5 divorces, she is straightway a phoenix. But hast thou heard that in Upper Egypt the phoenix has just been hatched out, as 'tis said? An event which happens not oftener than once in 5 centuries. Petronius, let us talk of the phoenix some other time. What shall I tell thee, my Marcus? I know Alice Plautius, who, though he blames my mode of life, has for me a certain weakness, and even respects me, perhaps, more than others, for he knows that I have never been an informer like Domitius off air, Tigellinus, and a whole rabble of Ahenobarbus's intimates. Nero's name was originally Domitius Ahenobarbus. Without pretending to be a Stoic, I have been offended more than once at acts of Nero, which Seneca and Burrus looked at through their fingers. If it is he thought that I might do something for thee with Alice, I am at thy command. I judge that thou hast the power. Thou hast influence over him, and, besides, thy mind possesses inexhaustible resources. If thou wert to survey the position and speak with Plautius, thou hast too great an idea of my influence and wit. But if that is the only question, I will talk with Plautius as soon as they return to the city. They returned 2 days since. In that case let us go to the triclinium, where a meal is now ready, and when we have refreshed ourselves, let us give command to bear us to Plautius. Thou hast ever been kind to me, answered Vinicius, with vivacity, but now I shall give command to rear thy statue among my Lares, just such a beauty as this one, and I will place offerings before it. Then he turned toward the statues which ornamented one entire wall of the perfumed chamber, and pointing to the one which represented Petronius's Hermes with a staff in his hand, he added, by the light of Helios, if the godlike Alexander resembled thee, I do not wonder at Helen. And in that exclamation there was as much sincerity as flattery, for Petronius, though older and less athletic, was more beautiful than even Vinicius. The women of Rome admired not only his pliant mind and his taste, which gained for him the title Arbiter Eleganti, but also his body. This admiration was evident even on the faces of those maidens from Cos who were arranging the folds of his toga, and one of whom, whose name was Eunice, loving him in secret, looked him in the eyes with submission and rapture. But he did not even notice this, and, smiling at Vinicius, he quoted in answer an expression of Seneca about woman, animal impudence, etc. And then, placing an arm on the shoulders of his nephew, he conducted him to the triclinium. In the unctorium the two Grecian maidens, the Phrygians, and the two Ethiopians began to put away the vessels with perfumes. But at that moment, and beyond the curtain of the frigidarium, appeared the heads of the balneators, and a low pst was heard. At that call one of the Grecians, the Phrygians, and the Ethiopians sprang up quickly, and vanished in a twinkle behind the curtain. In the baths began a moment of license which the inspector did not prevent, for he took frequent part in such frolics himself. Petronius suspected that they took place, but, as a prudent man, and one who did not like to punish, he looked at them through his fingers. In the unctorium only Eunice remained. She listened for a short time to the voices and laughter which retreated in the direction of the Laconicum. At last she took the stool inlaid with amber and ivory, on which Petronius had been sitting a short time before, and put it carefully at his statue. The unctorium was full of sunlight and the hues which came from the many-colored marbles with which the wall was faced. Eunice stood on the stool, and, finding herself at the level of the statue, cast her arm suddenly around its neck, then, throwing back her golden hair, and pressing her rosy body to the white marble, she pressed her lips with ecstasy to the cold lips of Petronius. Chapter 2. After a refreshment, which was called the morning meal and to which the two friends sat down at an hour when common mortals were already long past their midday prandium, Petronius proposed a light doze. According to him, it was too early for visits yet. There are, it is true, said he, people who begin to visit their acquaintances about sunrise, thinking that custom in old Roman one, but I look on this as barbarous. The afternoon hours are most proper, not earlier, however, than that one when the sun passes to the side of Jove's temple on the Capitol and begins to look slantwise on the Forum. In autumn it is still hot, and people are glad to sleep after eating. At the same time it is pleasant to hear the noise of the fountain in the atrium, and, after the obligatory 1,000 steps, to doze in the red light which filters in through the purple half-drawn velarium. Vinicius recognized the justice of these words, and the two men began to walk, speaking in a careless manner of what was to be heard on the Palatine and in the city, and philosophizing a little upon life. Petronius withdrew then to the cubiculum, but did not sleep long. In half an hour he came out, and, having given command to bring verbena, he inhaled the perfume and rubbed his hands and temples with it. "Thou wilt not believe," said he, "how it enlivens and freshens one. Now I am ready." The litter was waiting long since, hence they took their places, and Petronius gave command to bear them to the Vicus Patricius, to the house of Aulus. Petronius's insula lay on the southern slope of the Palatine, near the so-called Carina. Their nearest way, therefore, was below the Forum, but since Petronius wished to step in on the way to see the jeweler Idomeneus, he gave the direction to carry them along the Vicus Apollonis and the Forum in the direction of the Vicus Sceleratus, on the corner of which were many taberns of every kind. Gigantic Africans bore the litter and moved on, preceded by slaves called pedisequii. Petronius, after some time, raised to his nostrils in silence his palm odorous with verbena, and seemed to be meditating on something. "It occurs to me," said he after a while, "that if thy forest goddess is not a slave she might leave the house of Plautius, and transfer herself to thine. Thou wouldst surround her with love and cover her with wealth, as I do my adored Chrysothemis, of whom, speaking between us, I have quite as nearly enough as she has of me." Marcus shook his head. "No?" inquired Petronius. "In the worst event, the case would be left with Caesar, and thou mayst be certain that, thanks even to my influence, our Bronzebeard would be on thy side." "Thou knowest not Lygia," replied Vinicius. "Then permit me to ask if thou know her otherwise than by sight? Hast spoken with her? Hast confessed thy love to her?" "I saw her first at the fountain. Since then I have met her twice. Remember that during my stay in the house of Aulus, I dwelt in a separate villa, intended for guests, and, having a disjointed arm, I could not sit at the common table. Only on the eve of the day for which I announced my departure did I meet Lygia at supper, but I could not say a word to her. I had to listen to Aulus and his account of victories gained by him in Britain, and then of the fall of small states in Italy, which Licinius Stolo strove to prevent. In general, I do not know whether Alice will be able to speak of aught else, and do not think that we shall escape this history unless it be thy wish to hear about the effeminacy of these days. They have pheasants in their preserves, but they do not eat them, setting out from the principle that every pheasant eaten brings nearer the end of Roman power. I met her a second time at the garden cistern, with a freshly plucked reed in her hand, the top of which she dipped in the water and sprinkled the irises growing around. Look at my knees. By the shield of Hercules, I tell thee that they did not tremble when clouds of Parthians advanced on our maniples with howls, but they trembled before the cistern. And, confused as a youth who still wears a bulla on his neck, I merely begged pity with my eyes, not being able to utter a word for a long time. Petronius looked at him, as if with a certain envy. Happy man, said he, though the world and life were the worst possible, one thing in them will remain eternally good, youth. After a while he inquired, and hast thou not spoken to her? When I had recovered somewhat, I told her that I was returning from Asia, that I had disjointed my arm near the city, and had suffered severely, but at the moment of leaving that hospitable house I saw that suffering in it was more to be wished for than delight in another place, that sickness there was better than health somewhere else. Confused too on her part, she listened to my words with bent head while drawing something with the red on the saffron-colored sand. Afterwards she raised her eyes, then looked down at the marks drawn already. Once more she looked at me, as if to ask about something, and then fled on a sudden like a hamadryad before a dull fawn. She must have beautiful eyes, as the sea, and I was drowned in them, as in the sea. Believe me that the archipelago is less blue. After a while a little son of Plautius ran up with a question, but I did not understand what he wanted. "O Athene," exclaimed Petronius, "remove from the eyes of this youth the bandage with which Eros has bound them, if not, he will break his head against the columns of Venus's temple. O thou spring bud on the tree of life," said he, turning to Vinicius, "thou first green shoot of the vine, instead of taking thee to the Plautuses, I ought to give command to bear thee to the house of Gelasius, where there is a school for youths unacquainted with life. What dost thou wish in particular?" But what did she write on the sand? Was it not the name of a Moor, or a heart pierced with his dart, or something of such sort, that one might know from it that the satyrs had whispered to the ear of that nymph various secrets of life? How couldst thou help looking on those marks? "It is longer since I have put on the toga than seems to thee," said Vinicius, "and before little Alice ran up, I looked carefully at those marks, for I know that frequently maidens in Greece and in Rome draw on the sand a confession which their lips will not utter. But guess what she drew. If it is other than I supposed, I shall not guess." "A fish." "What dost thou say?" "I say, a fish." What did that mean? That cold blood is flowing in her veins? "So far I do not know, but thou, who hast called me a spring bud on the tree of life, wilt be able to understand the sign certainly." Carissime, ask such a thing of Pliny. He knows fish. If old Apicius were alive, he could tell thee something, for in the course of his life he ate more fish than could find place at one time in the Bay of Naples. Further conversation was interrupted, since they were borne into crowded streets where the noise of people hindered them. From the Vicus Apollonis they turned to the Bauarium, and then entered the Forum Romanum, where on clear days, before sunset, crowds of idle people assembled to stroll among the columns, to tell and hear news, to see noted people borne past in litters, and finally to look in at the jewelry shops, the book shops, the arches where coin was changed, shops for silk, bronze, and all other articles with which the buildings covering that part of the market-place opposite the Capitol were filled. One half of the Forum, immediately under the rock of the Capitol, was buried already in shade, but the columns of the temples, placed higher, seemed golden in the sunshine and the blue. Those lying lower cast lengthened shadows on marble slabs. The place was so filled with columns everywhere that the eye was lost in them as in a forest. Those buildings and columns seemed huddled together. They towered some above others, they stretched toward the right and the left, they climbed toward the height, and they clung to the wall of the Capitol, or some of them clung to others, like greater and smaller, thicker and thinner, white or gold-colored tree trunks, now blooming under architraves, flowers of the acanthus, now surrounded with Ionic corners, now finished with a simple Doric quadrangle. Above that forest gleamed colored triglyphs, from tympans stood forth the sculptured forms of gods, From the summit swinged golden quadriges seemed ready to fly away through space into the blue dome, fixed serenely above that crowded place of temples. Through the middle of the market and along the edges of it flowed a river of people. Crowds passed under the arches of the Basilica of Julius Caesar. Crowds were sitting on the steps of Castor and Pollux, or walking around the Temple of Vesta, resembling on that great marble background many-colored swarms of butterflies or beetles. Down immense steps, from the side of the temple on the Capitol dedicated to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, came new waves. At the rostra people listened to chance orators. In one place and another rose the shouts of hawkers selling fruit, wine, or water mixed with fig juice, of tricksters, of vendors of marvelous medicines, of soothsayers, of discoverers of hidden treasures, of interpreters of dreams. Here and there, in the tumult of conversations and cries, were mingled sounds of the Egyptian sistra, of the sambuc, or of Grecian flutes. Here and there the sick, the pious, or the afflicted were bearing offerings to the temples. In the midst of the people, on the stone flags, gathered flocks of doves, eager for the grain given them, and like movable many-colored and dark spots, now rising for a moment with a loud sound of wings, now dropping down again to places left vacant by people. From time to time the crowds opened before litters in which were visible the affected faces of women, or the heads of senators and knights, with features, as it were, rigid and exhausted from living. The many-tongued population repeated aloud their names, with the addition of some term of praise or ridicule. Among the unordered groups pushed from time to time, advancing with measured tread, parties of soldiers, or watchers, preserving order on the streets. Around about, the Greek language was heard as often as Latin. Vinicius, who had not been in the city for a long time, looked with a certain curiosity on that swarm of people and on that Forum Romanum, which both dominated the sea of the world and was flooded by it, so that Petronius, who divined the thoughts of his companion, called it the nest of the Quirites without the Quirites. In truth, the local element was well nigh lost in that crowd, composed of all races and nations. There appeared Ethiopians, gigantic light-haired people from the distant north, Britons, Gauls, Germans, sloping-eyed dwellers of Laricum, people from the Euphrates and from the Indus, with beards dyed brick color, Syrians from the banks of the Orontes, with black and mild eyes, dwellers in the deserts of Arabia, dried up as a bone, Jews, with their flat breasts, Egyptians, with the eternal, indifferent smile on their faces, Numidians and Africans, Greeks from Hellas, who equally with the Romans commanded the city, but commanded through science, art, wisdom, and deceit, Greeks from the islands, from Asia Minor, from Egypt, from Italy, from Narbonne Gaul. In the throng of slaves, with pierced ears, were not lacking also freemen, an idle population, which Caesar amused, supported, even clothed, and free visitors, whom the ease of life and the prospects of fortune enticed to the gigantic city. There was no lack of venal persons. There were priests of Serapis, with palm branches in their hands, priests of Isis, to whose altar more offerings were brought than to the temple of the Capitoline Jove, priests of Cybele, bearing in their hands golden ears of rice, and priests of nomad divinities, and dancers of the east with bright headdresses, and dealers in amulets, and snake tamers, and Chaldean seers, and, finally, people without any occupation whatever, who applied for grain every week at the storehouses on the Tiber, who fought for lottery tickets to the circus, who spent their nights in rickety houses of districts beyond the Tiber, and sunny and warm days under covered porticos, and in foul eating houses of the Subura, on the Milvian Bridge, or before the Insula the Great, where from time to time remnants from the tables of slaves were thrown out to them. Petronius was well known to those crowds. Vinicius's ears were struck continually by Hike. Here he is. They loved him for his munificence, and his peculiar popularity increased from the time when they learned that he had spoken before Caesar in opposition to the sentence of death issued against the whole familia, that is, against all the slaves of the prefect Pedanius Secundus, without distinction of sex or age, because one of them had killed that monster in a moment of despair. Petronius repeated in public, it is true, that it was all one to him, and that he had spoken to Caesar only privately, as the arbiter elegantiarum whose aesthetic taste was offended by a barbarous slaughter befitting Scythians and not Romans. Nevertheless, People who were indignant because of the slaughter loved Petronius from that moment forth. But he did not care for their love. He remembered that the crowd of people had loved also Britannicus, poisoned by Nero, and Agrippina, killed at his command, and Octavia, smothered in hot steam at the Pandataria, after her veins had been opened previously, and Rubelius Plautus, who had been banished, and Thrisi, to whom any mourning might bring a death sentence. The love of the mob might be considered rather of ill omen, and the skeptical Petronius was superstitious also. He had a twofold contempt for the multitude, as an aristocrat and an aesthetic person. Men with the odor of roast beans, which they carried in their bosoms, and who besides were eternally hoarse and sweating from playing mora on the street corners and peristyles, did not in his eyes deserve the term human. Hence he gave no answer whatever to the applause, or the kisses sent from lips here and there to him. He was relating to Marcus the case of Pedanius, reviling meanwhile the fickleness of that rabble which, next morning after the terrible butchery, applauded Nero on his way to the temple of Jupiter Stator. But he gave command to halt before the bookshop of Avernus, and, descending from the litter, purchased an ornamented manuscript, which he gave to Vinicius. "Here is a gift for thee," said he. "Thanks," answered Vinicius. Then, looking at the title, he inquired, "Satyricon, is this something new?" "Whose is it?" "Mine. But I do not wish to go in the road of Rufinus, whose history I was to tell thee, nor of Fabricius Veiento, hence no one knows of this, and do thou mention it to no man." "Thou hast said that thou art no writer of verses," said Vinicius, looking at the middle of tile manuscript, "but here I see prose thickly interwoven with them. When thou art reading, turn attention to Trimalchion's feast. As to verses, they have disgusted me, since Nero is writing an epic. Vitellius, when he wishes to relieve himself, uses ivory fingers to thrust down his throat. Others serve themselves with flamingo feather steeped in olive oil or in a decoction of wild thyme. I read Nero's poetry, and the result is immediate. Straightway I am able to praise it, if not with a clear conscience, at least with a clear stomach." When he had said this, he stopped the litter again before the shop of Idomeneus the goldsmith, and, having settled the affair of the gems, gave command to bear the litter directly to Alice's mansion. "On the road I will tell thee the story of Rufinus," said he, "as proof of what vanity in an author may be." But before he had begun, they turned into the Vicus Patricius, and soon found themselves before the dwelling of Alice. A young and sturdy janitor opened the door leading to the ostium, over which a magpie confined in a cage greeted them noisily with the word, "Salve." On the way from the second antechamber, called the ostium, to the atrium itself, Vinicius said, "Hast noticed that the doorkeepers are without chains?" "This is a wonderful house," answered Petronius, in an undertone. "Of course it is known to thee that Pomponia Graecina is suspected of entertaining that Eastern superstition which consists in honoring a certain Chrestos. It seems that Crispinilla rendered her this service, she who cannot forgive Pomponia because one husband has sufficed her for a lifetime. A one-man woman. Today, in Rome, it is easier to get a half-plate of fresh mushrooms from Noricum than to find such. They tried her before a domestic court. To thy judgment this is a wonderful house. Later on I will tell thee what I heard and saw in it." Meanwhile they had entered the atrium. The slave appointed to it, called Atriensis, sent a nomenclator to announce the guests, and Petronius, who, imagining that eternal sadness reigned in this severe house, had never been in it, looked around with astonishment, and as it were with a feeling of disappointment, for the atrium produced rather an impression of cheerfulness. A sheaf of bright light falling from above through a large opening broke into 1,000 sparks on a fountain in a quadrangular little basin, called the impluvium, which was in the middle to receive rain falling through the opening during bad weather. This was surrounded by anemones and lilies. In that house a special love for lilies was evident, for there were whole clumps of them, both white and red, and, finally, sapphire irises, whose delicate leaves were as if silvered from the spray of the fountain. Among the moist mosses, in which lily pots were hidden, and among the bunches of lilies were little bronze statues representing children and water birds. In one corner a bronze fawn, as if wishing to drink, was inclining its greenish head, grizzled, too, by dampness. The floor of the atrium was of mosaic, the walls, faced partly with red marble and partly with wood, on which were painted fish, birds, and griffins. attracted the eye by the play of colors. From the door to the side chamber they were ornamented with tortoiseshell or even ivory. At the walls between the doors were statues of Alice's ancestors. Everywhere calm plenty was evident, remote from excess, but noble and self-trusting. Petronius, who lived with incomparably greater show and elegance, could find nothing which offended his taste, and had just turned to Vinicius with that remark, when a slave, the Velarius, pushed aside the curtain separating the atrium from the tablinum, and in the depth of the building appeared Alice Plautius approaching hurriedly. He was a man nearing the evening of life, with a head whitened by hoarfrost, but fresh, with an energetic face, a trifle too short, but still somewhat eagle-like. This time there was expressed on it a certain astonishment, and even alarm, because of the unexpected arrival of Nero's friend, companion, and suggester. Petronius was too much a man of the world and too quick not to notice this, hence, after the first greetings, he announced with all the eloquence and ease at his command that he had come to give thanks for the care which his sister's son had found in that house, and that gratitude alone was the cause of the visit, to which, moreover, he was emboldened by his old acquaintance with Alice. Alice assured him that he was a welcome guest, and as to gratitude, he declared that he had that feeling himself, though surely Petronius did not divine the cause of it. In fact, Petronius did not divine it. In vain did he raise his hazel eyes, endeavoring to remember the least service rendered to Alice or to anyone. He recalled none, unless it might be that which he intended to show Vinicius. Some such thing, it is true, might have happened involuntarily, but only involuntarily. "I have great love and esteem for Vespasian, whose life thou didst save," said Alice, when he had the misfortune to doze while listening to Nero's verses. "He was fortunate," replied Petronius, "for he did not hear them, but I will not deny that the matter might have ended with misfortune." Bronzebeard wished absolutely to send a centurion to him with the friendly advice to open his veins. "But thou, Petronius, laughed him out of it." "That is true, or rather it is not true. I told Nero that if Orpheus put wild beasts to sleep with song, his triumph was equal, since he had put Vespasian to sleep. Ahenobarbus may be blamed on condition that to a small criticism a great flattery be added. Our gracious Augusta, Poppaea, understands this to perfection." "Alas! Such are the times," answered Alice. "I lacked 2 front teeth, knocked out by a stone from the hand of a Briton. I speak with a hiss. Still my happiest days were passed in Britain." "Because they were days of victory," added Vinicius. But Petronius, alarmed lest the old general might begin a narrative of his former wars, changed the conversation. "See," said he, "in the neighborhood of Praenest country people found a dead wolf whelp with 2 heads, and during a storm about that time lightning struck off an angle of the temple of Luna, a thing unparalleled, because of the late autumn." A certain Cotta, too, who had told this, added, while telling it, that the priests of that temple prophesied the fall of the city or, at least, the ruin of a great house, ruin to be averted only by uncommon sacrifices. Alice, when he had heard the narrative, expressed the opinion that such signs should not be neglected, that the gods might be angered by an overmeasure of wickedness. In this there was nothing wonderful, and in such an event expiatory sacrifices were perfectly in order. "Thy house, Plautius, is not too large," answered Petronius, "though a great man lives in it." "Mine is indeed too large for such a wretched owner, though equally small. But if it is a question of the ruin of something as great, for example, as the Domus Transitoria, would it be worthwhile for us to bring offerings to avert that ruin?" Plautius did not answer that question, a carefulness which touched even Petronius somewhat, for, with all his inability to feel the difference between good and evil, he had never been an informer, and it was possible to talk with him in perfect safety. He changed the conversation again, therefore, and began to praise Plautius's dwelling and the good taste which reigned in the house. "It is an ancient seat," said Plautius, "in which nothing has been changed since I inherited it." After the curtain was pushed aside which divided the atrium from the tablinum, the house was open from end to end, so that through the tablinum and the following peristyle in the hall line beyond it which was called the Ecus, the glance extended to the garden, which seemed from a distance like a bright image set in a dark frame. Joyous, childlike laughter came from it to the atrium. "Oh, General," said Petronius, "permit us to listen from nearby to that glad laughter which is of a kind heard so rarely in these days." "Willingly," answered Plautius, rising, that is my little Alice and Ligia, playing ball. But as to laughter, I think, Petronius, that our whole life is spent in it. Life deserves laughter, hence people laugh at it, answered Petronius, but laughter here has another sound. Petronius does not laugh for days in succession, said Vinicius, but then he laughs entire nights. Thus conversing, they passed through the length of the house and reached the garden, where Lygia and little Alice were playing with balls, which slaves, appointed to that game exclusively and called spherist, picked up and placed in their hands. Petronius cast a quick passing glance at Lygia. Little Alice, seeing Vinicius, ran to greet him, but the young tribune, going forward, bent his head before the beautiful maiden, who stood with the ball in her hand, her hair blown apart a little. She was somewhat out of breath, and flushed. In the garden triclinium, shaded by ivy, grapes, and woodbine, sat Pomponia Graecina, hence they went to salute her. She was known to Petronius, though he did not visit Plautius, for he had seen her at the house of Antistia, the daughter of Rubelius Plautus, and besides at the house of Seneca and Polion. He could not resist a certain admiration with which he was filled by her face, pensive but mild, by the dignity of her bearing, by her movements, by her words. Pomponia disturbed his understanding of women to such a degree that that man, corrupted to the marrow of his bones, and self-confident as no one in Rome, not only felt for her a kind of esteem, but even lost his previous self-confidence. And now, thanking her for her care of Vinicius, he thrust in, as it were involuntarily, Domine, which never occurred to him when speaking, for example, to Calvia Crispinilla, Scribonia, Valeria, Saulina, and other women of high society. After he had greeted her and returned thanks, he began to complain that he saw her so rarely, that it was not possible to meet her either in the circus or the amphitheater, to which she answered calmly, laying her hand on the hand of her husband, "We are growing old, and love our domestic quiet more and more, both of us." Petronius wished to oppose, but Alice Plautius added in his hissing voice, "And we feel stranger and stranger among people who give Greek names to our Roman divinities." "The gods have become for some time mere figures of rhetoric," replied Petronius, carelessly. "But since Greek rhetoricians taught us, it is easier for me even to say Hera than Juno." He turned his eyes then to Pomponia, as if to signify that in presence of her no other divinity could come to his mind, and then he began to contradict what she had said touching old age. People grow old quickly, it is true, but there are some who live another life entirely, and there are faces moreover which Saturn seems to forget. Petronius said this with a certain sincerity even, for Pomponia Graecina, though descending from the midday of life, had preserved an uncommon freshness of face, and since she had a small head and delicate features, she produced at times, despite her dark robes, despite her solemnity and sadness, the impression of a woman quite young. Meanwhile little Alice, who had become uncommonly friendly with Vinicius during his former stay in the house, approached the young man and entreated him to play ball. Ligia herself entered the triclinium after the little boy. Under the climbing ivy, with the light quivering on her face, she seemed to Petronius more beautiful than at the first glance, and really like some nymph. As he had not spoken to her thus far, he rose, inclined his head, and, instead of the usual expressions of greeting, quoted the words with which Ulysses greeted Nausicaa, "I supplicate thee, O Queen, whether thou art some goddess or a mortal. If thou art one of the daughters of men who dwell on earth, thrice blessed are thy father and thy lady mother, and thrice blessed thy brethren." The exquisite politeness of this man of the world pleased even Pomponia. As to Ligia, she listened, confused and flushed, without boldness to raise her eyes. But a wayward smile began to quiver at the corners of her lips, and on her face a struggle was evident between the timidity of a maiden and the wish to answer, but clearly the wish was victorious, for, looking quickly at Petronius, she answered him all at once with the words of that same Nausicaa, quoting them at one breath, and a little like a lesson learned, "Stranger, thou seemest no evil man nor foolish." Then she turned and ran out as a frightened bird runs. This time the turn for astonishment came to Petronius, for he had not expected to hear verses of Homer from the lips of a maiden of whose barbarian extraction he had heard previously from Vinicius. Hence he looked with an inquiring glance at Pomponia, but she could not give him an answer, for she was looking at that moment, with a smile, at the pride reflected on the face of her husband. He was not able to conceal that pride. First, he had become attached to Lygia as to his own daughter, and second, in spite of his old Roman prejudices, which commanded him to thunder against Greek and the spread of the language, he considered it as the summit of social polish. He himself had never been able to learn it well. Over this he suffered in secret. He was glad, therefore, that an answer was given in the language and poetry of Homer to this exquisite man both of fashion and letters, who was ready to consider Plautius's house as barbarian. "We have in the house a pedagogue, a Greek," said he, turning to Petronius, "who teaches our boy, and the maiden overhears the lessons. She is a wagtail yet, but a dear one, to which we have both grown attached." Petronius looked through the branches of woodbine into the garden, and at the three persons who were playing there. Vinicius had thrown aside his toga, and, wearing only his tunic, was striking the ball, which Ligia, standing opposite, with raised arms was trying to catch. The maiden did not make a great impression on Petronius at the first glance. She seemed to him too slender. But from the moment when he saw her more nearly in the triclinium he thought to himself that Aurora might look like her, and as a judge he understood that in her there was something uncommon. He considered everything and estimated everything, hence her face, rosy and clear, her fresh lips, as if set for a kiss, her eyes blue as the azure of the sea, the alabaster whiteness of her forehead, the wealth of her dark hair, with the reflection of amber or Corinthian bronze gleaming in its folds, her slender neck, the divine slope of her shoulders, the whole posture, flexible, slender, young with the youth of May and of freshly opened flowers. The artist was roused in him, and the worshipper of beauty, who felt that beneath a statue of that maiden one might write spring. All at once he remembered Chrysothemis, and pure laughter seized him. Chrysothemis seemed to him, with golden powder on her hair and darkened brows, to be fabulously faded, something in the nature of a yellowed rose tree shedding its leaves. But still Rome envied him that Chrysothemis. Then he recalled Poppaea, and that most famous Poppaea also seemed to him soulless, a waxen mask. In that maiden with Danagrian outlines there was not only spring, but a radiant soul, which shone through her rosy body as a flame through a lamp. Vinicius is right, thought he, and my Chrysothemis is old as Troy. Then he turned to Pomponia Graecina, and, pointing to the garden, said, "I understand now, Domine, why thou and thy husband prefer this house to the circus and to feasts on the Palatine." "Yes," answered she, turning her eyes in the direction of little Alice and Ligia. But the old general began to relate the history of the maiden, and what he had heard years before from Aedalius' history about the Lygian people who lived in the gloom of the north. The three outside had finished playing ball, and for some time had been walking along the sand of the garden, appearing against the dark background of myrtles and cypresses like three white statues. Ligia held little Alice by the hand. After they had walked a while they sat on a bench near the fish pond, which occupied the middle of the garden. After a time Alice sprang up to frighten the fish in the transparent water, but Vinicius continued the conversation begun during the walk. "Yes," said he, in a low, quivering voice, scarcely audible, "barely had I cast aside the pretexta, when I was sent to the legions in Asia. I had not become acquainted with the city, nor with life, nor with love. I know a small bit of Anacreon by heart, and Horace, but I cannot like Petronius quote verses, when reason is dumb from admiration and unable to find its own words. While a youth I went to school to Musonius, who told me that happiness consists in wishing what the gods wish, and therefore depends on our will. I think, however, that it is something else, something greater and more precious, which depends not on the will, for love only can give it. The gods themselves seek that happiness, hence I too, O Ligia, who have not known love thus far, follow in their footsteps. I also seek her who would give me happiness." He was silent, and for a time there was nothing to be heard save the light plash of the water into which little Alice was throwing pebbles to frighten the fish. But after a while Vinicius began again in a voice still softer and lower, "But thou knowest of Vespasian's son Titus?" They say that he had scarcely ceased to be a youth when he so loved Berenice that grief almost drew the life out of him. "So could I too love, O Ligia. Riches, glory, power are mere smoke, vanity. The rich man will find a richer than himself, the greater glory of another will eclipse a man who is famous. A strong man will be conquered by a stronger. But can Caesar himself, can any god even, experience greater delight or be happier than a simple mortal at the moment when at his breast there is breathing another dear breast, or when he kisses beloved lips. Hence love makes us equal to the gods, O Lygia. And she listened with alarm, with astonishment, and at the same time as if she were listening to the sound of a Grecian flute or a sthara. It seemed to her at moments that Vinicius was singing a kind of wonderful song, which was instilling itself into her ears, moving the blood in her, and penetrating her heart with a faintness, a fear, and a kind of uncomprehended delight. It seemed to her also that he was telling something which was in her before, but of which she could not give account to herself. She felt that he was rousing in her something which had been sleeping hitherto, and that in that moment a hazy dream was changing into a form more and more definite, more pleasing, more beautiful. Meanwhile the sun had passed the Tiber long since, and had sunk low over the Janiculum. On the motionless cypresses ruddy light was falling, and the whole atmosphere was filled with it. Ligia raised on Vinicius her blue eyes as if roused from sleep, and he, bending over her with a prayer quivering in his eyes, seemed on a sudden, in the reflections of evening, more beautiful than all men, than all Greek and Roman gods whose statues she had seen on the facades of temples. And with his fingers he clasped her arm lightly just above the wrist and asked, "Dost thou not divine what I say to thee, Lygia?" "No," whispered she as answer, in a voice so low that Vinicius barely heard it. But he did not believe her, and, drawing her hand toward him more vigorously, he would have drawn it to his heart, which, under the influence of desire roused by the marvelous maiden, was beating like a hammer, and would have addressed burning words to her directly had not old Alice appeared on a path set in a frame of myrtles, who said, while approaching them, "The sun is setting, so beware of the evening coolness, and do not trifle with Libertina." "No," answered Vinicius, "I have not put on my toga yet, and I do not feel the cold. But see, barely half the sun's shield is looking from behind the hill. That is a sweet climate of Sicily, where people gather on the square before sunset and take farewell of disappearing Phoebus with a choral song." And, forgetting that a moment earlier he had warned them against Libitina, he began to tell about Sicily, where he had estates and large cultivated fields which he loved. He stated also that it had come to his mind more than once to remove to Sicily, and live out his life there in quietness. He whose head winters have whitened has bad enough of hoarfrost. Leaves are not falling from the trees yet, and the sky smiles on the city lovingly, but when the grapevines grow yellow-leaved, when snow falls on the Alban hills, and the gods visit the Campania with piercing wind, who knows but I may remove with my entire household to my quiet country seat. "Wouldst thou leave Rome?" inquired Vinicius, with sudden alarm. "I have wished to do so this long time, for it is quieter in Sicily and safer." And again he fell to praising his gardens, his herds, his house hidden in green, and the hills grown over with thyme and savory, among which were swarms of buzzing bees. But Vinicius paid no heed to that bucolic note, and from thinking only of this, that he might lose Ligia, he looked toward Petronius as if expecting salvation from him alone. Meanwhile Petronius, sitting near Pomponia, was admiring the view of the setting sun, the garden, and the people standing near the fish pond. Their white garments on the dark background of the myrtles gleamed like gold from the evening rays. On the sky the evening light had begun to assume purple and violet hues, and to change like an opal. A strip of the sky became lily-colored. The dark silhouettes of the cypresses grew still more pronounced than during bright daylight. In the people, in the trees, in the whole garden there reigned an evening calm. That calm struck Petronius, and it struck him especially in the people. In the faces of Pomponia, old Alice, their son, and Lygia there was something such as he did not see in the faces which surrounded him every day, or rather every night. There was a certain light, a certain repose, a certain serenity, flowing directly from the life which all lived there. And with a species of astonishment he thought that a beauty and sweetness might exist which he, who chased after beauty and sweetness continually, had not known. He could not hide the thought in himself, and said, turning to Pomponia, "I am considering in my soul how different this world of yours is from the world which our Nero rules." She raised her delicate face toward the evening light, and said with simplicity, "Not Nero, but God, rules the world." A moment of silence followed. Near the triclinium were heard in the alley, the steps of the old general, Vinicius, Lygia, and little Alice, but before they arrived, Petronius had put another question. But believest thou in the gods, then, Pomponia? I believe in God, who is one, just, and all-powerful, answered the wife of Aulus Plautius. Chapter 3. She believes in God who is one, all-powerful, and just, said Petronius, when he found himself again in the litter with Vinicius. If her God is all-powerful, he controls life and death, and if he is just, he sends death justly. Why, then, does Pomponia wear mourning for Julius? In mourning for Julius she blames her God. I must repeat this reasoning to our Bronzebeard, the monkey, since I consider that in dialectics I am the equal of Socrates. As to women, I agree that each has 3 or 4 souls, but none of them a reasoning one. Let Pomponia meditate with Seneca or Cornutus over the question of what their great logos is. Let them summon at once the shades of Xenophanes, Parmenides, Zeno, and Plato, who are as much wearied there in Cimmerian regions as a finch in a cage. I wished to talk with her and with Plautius about something else. By the holy stomach of the Egyptian Isis! If I had told them right out directly why we came, I suppose that their virtue would have made as much noise as a bronze shield under the blow of a club. And I did not dare to tell. Wilt thou believe, Vinicius, I did not dare. Peacocks are beautiful birds, but they have too shrill a cry. I feared an outburst. But I must praise thy choice. A real rosy-fingered aurora. And knowest thou what she reminded me of too? Spring. Not our spring in Italy, where an apple tree merely puts forth a blossom here and there, and olive groves grow gray, just as they were gray before, but the spring which I saw once in Helvetia, young, fresh, bright green. By that pale moon, I do not wonder at thee, Marcus, but know that thou art loving Diana, because Aulus and Pomponia are ready to tear thee to pieces, as the dogs once tore Actaeon. Vinicius was silent a time without raising his head, then he began to speak with a voice broken by passion. I desired her before, but now I desire her still more. When I caught her arm, flame embraced me. I must have her. Were I Zeus, I would surround her with a cloud, as he surrounded Io, or I would fall on her and rain, as he fell on Danae. I would kiss her lips till it pained. I would hear her scream in my arms. I would kill Aulus and Pomponia, and bear her home in my arms. I will not sleep tonight. I will give command to flog one of my slaves, and listen to his groans. Calm thyself, said Petronius. Thou hast the longing of a carpenter from the Suburra. All one to me what thou say'st. I must have her. I have turned to thee frayed, but if thou wilt not find it, I shall find it myself. Aulus considers Ligia as a daughter. Why should I look on her as a slave? And since there is no other way, let her ornament the door of my house, let her anoint it with wolf's fat, and let her sit at my hearth as wife. Calm thyself, mad descendant of consuls. We do not lead in barbarians bound behind our cars, to make wives of their daughters. Beware of extremes. Exhaust simple, honorable methods, and give thyself and me time for meditation. Chrysothemis seemed to me too a daughter of Jove, and still I did not marry her, just as Nero did not marry Acte, though they called her a daughter of King Attalus. Calm thyself. Think that if she wishes to leave Aulus for thee, he will have no right to detain her. Know also that thou art not burning alone, for Eros has roused in her the flame too. I saw that, and it is well to believe me. Have patience. There is a way to do everything, but today I have thought too much already, and it tires me. But I promise that tomorrow I will think of thy love, and unless Petronius is not Petronius, he will discover some method. They were both silent again. I thank thee, said Vinicius at last. May fortune be bountiful to thee. Be patient. Whither hast thou given command to bear us? To Chrysothemis. Thou art happy in possessing her whom thou lovest. I? Dost thou know what amuses me yet in Chrysothemis? This, that she is false to me with my freedman Thecles, and thinks that I do not notice it. Once I loved her, but now she amuses me with her lying and stupidity. Come with me to her. Should she begin to flirt with thee, and write letters on the table with her fingers steeped in wine, know that I shall not be jealous. And he gave command to bear them both to Chrysothemis. But in the entrance Petronius put his hand on Vinicius's shoulder, and said, Wait, it seems to me that I have discovered a plan. May all the gods reward thee. I have it. I judge that this plan is infallible. Knowest what, Marcus? I listen to thee, my wisdom. Well, in a few days the divine Lygia will partake of Demeter's grain in thy house. Thou art greater than Caesar, exclaimed Vinicius with enthusiasm. Chapter 4. In fact, Petronius kept his promise. He slept all the day following his visit to Chrysothemis, it is true, but in the evening he gave command to bear him to the Palatine, where he had a confidential conversation with Nero. In consequence of this, on the third day a centurion, at the head of some tens of praetorian soldiers, appeared before the house of Plautius. The period was uncertain and terrible. Messengers of this kind were more frequently heralds of death. So when the centurion struck the hammer at Alice's door, and when the guard of the atrium announced that there were soldiers in the anteroom, terror rose through the whole house. The family surrounded the old general at once, for no one doubted that danger hung over him above all. Pomponia, embracing his neck with her arms, clung to him with all her strength, and her blue lips moved quickly while uttering some whispered phrase. Lygia, with a face pale as linen, kissed his hand. Little Alice clung to his toga. From the corridor, from chambers in the lower story intended for servant women and attendants, from the bath, from the arches of lower dwellings, from the whole house, crowds of slaves began to hurry out, and the cries of me miserum were heard. The women broke into great weeping, some scratched their cheeks, or covered their heads with kerchiefs. Only the old general himself, accustomed for years to look death straight in the eye, remained calm, and his short eagle face became as rigid as if chiseled from stone. After a while, when he had silenced the uproar, and commanded the attendants to disappear, he said, "Let me go, Pomponia. If my end has come, we shall have time to take leave." And he pushed her aside gently, but she said, "God grant thy fate and mine to be one, O Alice." Then, failing on her knees, she began to pray with that force which fear for some dear one alone can give. Alice passed out to the atrium, where the centurion was waiting for him. It was old Chrysosta, his former subordinate and companion in British wars. "I greet thee, General," said he. "I bring a command, and the greeting of Caesar. Here are the tablets and the signet to show that I come in his name." "I am thankful to Caesar for the greeting, and I shall obey the command," answered Alice. "Be welcome, Asta, and say what command thou hast brought." "Alice Plautius," began Asta, "Caesar has learned that in thy house is dwelling the daughter of the king of the Lygians, whom that king during the life of the divine Claudius gave into the hands of the Romans as a pledge that the boundaries of the empire would never be violated by the Lygians. The divine Nero is grateful to thee, O general, because thou hast given her hospitality in thy house for so many years, but, not wishing to burden thee longer, and considering also that the maiden as a hostage should be under the guardianship of Caesar and the Senate, he commands thee to give her into my hands." Alice was too much a soldier and too much a veteran to permit himself regret in view of an order, or vain words, or complaint. A slight wrinkle of sudden anger and pain, however, appeared on his forehead. Before that frown legions in Britain had trembled on a time, and even at that moment fear was evident on the face of Asta. But in view of the order, Alice Plautius felt defenseless. He looked for some time at the tablets and the signet, then raising his eyes to the old centurion, he said calmly, "Wait, Asta, in the atrium till the hostage is delivered to thee." After these words he passed to the other end of the house, to the hall called Ecus, where Pomponia Graecina, Lygia, and little Alice were waiting for him in fear and alarm. "Death threatens no one, nor banishment to distant islands," said he, "still Caesar's messenger is a herald of misfortune." "It is a question of thee, Lygia." "Of Lygia?" exclaimed Pomponia, with astonishment. "Yes," answered Alice. And turning to the maiden, he began, "Lygia, thou wert reared in our house as our own child. I and Pomponia love thee as our daughter. But know this, that thou art not our daughter. Thou art a hostage, given by thy people to Rome, and guardianship over thee belongs to Caesar. Now Caesar takes thee from our house." The general spoke calmly, but with a certain strange, unusual voice. Lygia listened to his words, blinking, as if not understanding what the question was. Pomponia's cheeks became pallid. In the doors leading from the corridor to the Ecus, terrified faces of slaves began to show themselves a second time. "The will of Caesar must be accomplished," said Alice. "Alice," exclaimed Pomponia, embracing the maiden with her arms, as if wishing to defend her, "it would be better for her to die." Lygia, nestling up to her breast, repeated, "Mother, mother." Unable in her sobbing to find other words. On Alice's face anger and pain were reflected again. "If I were alone in the world," said he, gloomily, I would not surrender her alive, and my relatives might give offerings this day to Jupiter Liberator. But I have not the right to kill thee and our child, who may live to happier times. I will go to Caesar this day, and implore him to change his command. Whether he will hear me, I know not. Meanwhile, farewell, Lygia, and know that I and Pomponia ever bless the day in which thou didst take thy seat at our hearth. Thus speaking, he placed his hand on her head, but though he strove to preserve his calmness, when Lygia turned to him eyes filled with tears, and seizing his hand pressed it to her lips, his voice was filled with deep fatherly sorrow. Farewell, our joy, and the light of our eyes, said he. And he went to the atrium quickly, so as not to let himself be conquered by emotion unworthy of a Roman and a general. Meanwhile Pomponia, when she had conducted Lygia to the cubiculum, began to comfort, console, and encourage her, uttering words meanwhile which sounded strangely in that house, where near them in an adjoining chamber the lorarium remained yet, and where the hearth was on which Alice Plautius, faithful to ancient usage, made offerings to the household divinities. Now the hour of trial had come. On a time Virginius had pierced the bosom of his own daughter to save her from the hands of Appius. Still earlier Lucretia had redeemed her shame with her life. The house of Caesar is a den of infamy, of evil, of crime. But we, Lygia, know why we have not the right to raise hands on ourselves. Yes, the law under which we both live is another, a greater, a holier, but it gives permission to defend oneself from evil and shame even should it happen to pay for that defense with life and torment. Whoso goes forth pure from the dwelling of corruption has the greater merit thereby. The earth is that dwelling, but fortunately life is one twinkle of the eye, and resurrection is only from the grave. Beyond that not Nero, but mercy bears rule, and there instead of pain is delight, there instead of tears is rejoicing. Next she began to speak of herself. Yes, she was calm, but in her breast there was no lack of painful wounds. For example, Alice was a cataract on her eye, the fountain of light had not flowed to him yet. Neither was it permitted her to rear her son in truth. When she thought, therefore, that it might be thus to the end of her life, and that for them a moment of separation might come which would be 100 times more grievous and terrible than the temporary one over which they were both suffering then, she could not so much as understand how she might be happy even in heaven without them. And she had wept many nights through already, she had passed many nights in prayer, imploring grace and mercy. But she offered her suffering to God, and waited and trusted. And now, when a new blow struck her, when the tyrant's command took from her a dear one, the one whom Alice had called the light of their eyes, she trusted yet, believing that there was a power greater than Nero's and a mercy mightier than his anger. And she pressed the maiden's head to her bosom still more firmly. Lygia dropped to her knees after a while, and, covering her eyes in the folds of Pomponia's peplus, she remained thus a long time in silence, but when she stood up again, some calmness was evident on her face. I grieve for thee, mother, and for father and for my brother, but I know that resistance is useless, and would destroy all of us. I promise thee that in the house of Caesar I will never forget thy words. Once more she threw her arms around Pomponia's neck, then both went out to the Ecus, and she took farewell of little Alice, of the old Greek their teacher, of the dressing maid who had been her nurse, and of all the slaves. One of these, a tall and broad-shouldered Lygian, called Ursus in the house, who with other servants had in his time gone with Lygia's mother and her to the camp of the Romans, fell now at her feet, and then bent down to the knees of Pomponia, saying, O Domine, permit me to go with my lady, to serve her and watch over her in the house of Caesar. Thou art not our servant, but Lygia's, answered Pomponia, but if they admit thee through Caesar's doors, in what way wilt thou be able to watch over her? I know not, Domine, I know only that iron breaks in my hands just as wood does. When Alice, who came up at that moment, had heard what the question was, not only did he not oppose the wishes of Ursus, but he declared that he had not even the right to detain him. They were sending away Lygia as a hostage whom Caesar had claimed, and they were obliged in the same way to send her retinue, which passed with her to the control of Caesar. Here he whispered to Pomponia that under the form of an escort she could add as many slaves as she thought proper, for the centurion could not refuse to receive them. There was a certain comfort for Lygia in this. Pomponia also was glad that she could surround her with servants of her own choice. Therefore, Besides Ursus, she appointed to her the old tirewoman, 2 maidens from Cyprus well skilled in hairdressing, and 2 German maidens for the bath. Her choice fell exclusively on adherents of the new faith. Ursus, too, had professed it for a number of years. Pomponia could count on the faithfulness of those servants, and at the same time consoled herself with the thought that soon grains of truth would be in Caesar's house. She wrote a few words also, committing care over Lygia to Nero's freedwoman, Octe. Pomponia had not seen her, it is true, at meetings of confessors of the new faith, but she had heard from them that Octe had never refused them a service, and that she read the letters of Paul of Tarsus eagerly. It was known to her also that the young freedwoman lived in melancholy, that she was a person different from all other women of Nero's house, and that in general she was the good spirit of the palace. Asta engaged to deliver the letter himself to Octe. Considering it natural that the daughter of a king should have a retinue of her own servants, he did not raise the least difficulty in taking them to the palace, but wondered rather that there should be so few. He begged haste, however, fearing lest he might be suspected of want of zeal in carrying out orders. The moment of parting came. The eyes of Pomponia and Ligia were filled with fresh tears. Aulus placed his hand on her head again, and after a while the soldiers, followed by the cry of little Aulus, who in defense of his sister threatened the centurion with his small fists, conducted Lygia to Caesar's house. The old general gave command to prepare his litter at once. Meanwhile, shutting himself up with Pomponia in the Pinacoteca adjoining the Ecus, he said to her, "Listen to me, Pomponia. I will go to Caesar, though I judge that my visit will be useless, and though Seneca's word means nothing with Nero now, I will go also to Seneca. Today Sophonius, Tigellinus, Petronius, or Vadinius have more influence. As to Caesar, perhaps he has never even heard of the Lygian people, and if he has demanded the delivery of Lygia, the hostage, he has done so because some one persuaded him to it. It is easy to guess who could do that." She raised her eyes to him quickly. "Is it Petronius?" "It is." A moment of silence followed, then the general continued, "See what it is to admit over the threshold any of those people without conscience or honor. Cursed be the moment in which Vinicius entered our house, for he brought Petronius. Woe to Lygia, since those men are not seeking a hostage, but a concubine." And his speech became more hissing than usual, because of helpless rage and of sorrow for his adopted daughter. He struggled with himself some time, and only his clenched fists showed how severe was the struggle within him. "I have revered the gods so far," said he, "but at this moment I think that not they are over the world, but one mad, malicious monster named Nero." "Aulus," said Pomponia, "Nero is only a handful of rotten dust before God." But Aulus began to walk with long steps over the mosaic of the Pinacoteca. In his life there had been great deeds, but no great misfortunes, hence he was unused to them. The old soldier had grown more attached to Lygia than he himself had been aware of, and now he could not be reconciled to the thought that he had lost her. Besides, he felt humiliated. A hand was weighing on him which he despised, and at the same time he felt that before its power his power was as nothing. But when at last he stifled in himself the anger which disturbed his thoughts, he said, "I judge that Petronius has not taken her from us for Caesar, since he would not offend Poppaea. Therefore he took her either for himself or Vinicius. Today I will discover this." And after a while the litter bore him in the direction of the Palatine. Pomponia, when left alone, went to little Aulus, who did not cease crying for his sister, or threatening Caesar.